part 3 of my Superior Drummer tutorial, where I'll be covering a preset using the Metal Foundry add-on. I know my tutorials have been pretty long on this, longer than I expected them to be, so if you just want to skip straight to the preset, you'll find it down in the description. But if you want to hang around and learn a bit about the way I put it together, then please stick with me, and as always there's some links down the left to help you navigate through quickly if you want to skip any parts. Just a quick listen to the kit that I've created using Metal Foundry. It's the same drum pattern I used for the Avatar one, so you can compare them if you want, but here we go. Again, using the Superior Drummer inserts, all of their own ones instead of using my DAW ones, which if you listen to any of my other episodes you will know that I don't really suggest using these if you can avoid it, but it is good for maybe jamming or just messing around with the kit, or if you really just want to have one stereo out for your whole kit, then you would need to use these, and they do the job. They're not too bad. A very quick overview here. I don't want to go into too much detail because I've done that in the last 2 videos, but if you do buy the Metal Foundry kit, then you can see immediately it's a lot bigger than the Avatar kit. You get a double kick option, which is great obviously, and you get a very good wide selection of kick drums. A bit more in the way of toms as well. The Avatar kit was pretty thin on the ground with toms, but they were very good sounds. They really are some good variation in sounds, so you won't be disappointed with that. And with cymbals as well. I mean, you can see here there's just a wonderful variation and a lot of available cymbals here. And as always, I encourage you to really think about, don't just click on cymbals and choose them at random. They're all there for a reason. They should all be performing a function. If you've got too many that are too similar, they're just pointless, using up your memory for no good reason. Have a quick look at this X drum that I went through a tutorial in part 1 to explain how to create this, but all I've done is taken one particular drum, free floating pearl maple, fairly standard sounding, and I've doubled it with a slightly deeper pearl reference that's been pitched down slightly. Now the reason for that is, as always when you're recording with snares, they are probably the weakest drum, so by doubling up I've just aided the recording process or the mixing process later on by giving it a bit more power. Don't really want to spend any more time on the X drum feature. I covered that in an earlier episode. We'll just get straight down to the detail here. Just a quick overview of what I've done in the mixer. Now, as with the Avatar kit, in general I've set this up so that it's going out of the 1-2 stereo. Most of the outputs will be going there. However, the kicks, the snare microphones and the tom microphones I have routed to buses, which I've named kick snare toms. And if we go past the channel strips to the buses here, you can see kick snare toms I've created there. And different to the Avatar kit, I've actually created a parallel compression track here as well, and also a further snare track, because I found that the snare really did need beefing up with this kit because the other instruments were quite a lot more powerful. One difference to the Avatar kit is that you do get your left kick and your right kick. You'll see I've used EQ filter and a transient shaper on these. A transient shaper, if you don't know, what this does is it's almost like a compressor that helps you control, a compressor and a gate all in one really, helps you control the initial thwack of a very short sharp sound by deciding how loud that's going to be, and then deciding when it's going to cut off with the sustain knob here, so you can really increase the initial hit and then decrease the air and the flabbiness of the kick that comes after it to tighten it up, and it works pretty well. I've duplicated the plugins from one channel to the other there. Just a quick tip for you, if you're down Control and Move, you copy the plugin with its settings, so that's a good shortcut there for copying things over. But then over on the kick bus, there's also heavy effects going on here as well, so what I want to do is turn all of them off and give you a quick tour of what I've had to do with these to get the sound that we're working with. Just get the kick looping there, and you can hear that's a very natural sounding kick, very roomy, bit flabby. I've started with an EQ here, immediate difference there, and I've had to create the sort of standard metal kick EQ shape, scooping out the middle, raising a bit of the low end, but as you can see the EQ is very limited in that I can't roll off this real low end here. I've added in a filter to allow me to do that. I've also changed the type of the curve though, so that it does give me a bit of a resonant raise just around what I'm assuming is the 60 to 80 mark there. And then finally a transient shaper on there just to beef up the initial sound. But then over in the bus, I then found, if I stop that for a second while I talk, I mentioned in the earlier episodes that stacking inserts was pretty much a necessity with this, and that's because with things like the EQ, if we look at this, you only got 5 bands. The Q isn't particularly detailed, so you do often find you've got to stack more than one to get the results you're after. Normally I would not recommend doing that, but in this program it does seem to be a necessity to get a decent sound. So if I get this going again, this kick, I was finding it's slightly weak, so I added another EQ, just enhancing the sort of equalizer curve that it's already got. Another filter was required because of that, because of the EQ. There was a bit of low end coming through that I didn't want. And finally that filter did actually take out a bit too much to the low end, and I was finding I needed to put another one back on the end to add in a bit of the subby end at around the 50 mark. Talking of the sub, there is a sub coming through here as well. It was just like with the Avatar kit, I've enhanced the parts of the sub I want and I've got rid of everything else. That's very similar effect. So there's our double kick working like that. I think that's a pretty good kick sound all in all. Moving on to the snares. Now you really get a lot of options in Metal Foundry when it comes to your snare. You've got 2 top mics, one a condenser, one a dynamic. Now condenser mic tends to generally give you a fuller, more middly sound, and a dynamic tends to give a sharper, more trebly sound. So they're giving you both options there, and you get the same with the bottom, a condenser and a dynamic. And then you get one further one they've called Snare Trash, which I believe is just a simple closely mic'd room mic set on the snare there. And I've used all 5 of these because the snare sound did seem very weak when up against the toms and the kick. I've routed them all to a snare bus, so I didn't feel the need to do much in the way of processing here, but there's more going on than meets the eye. I did a bit of EQing on one of the condenser tracks because I found at this point here where I've pulled this down there was a nasty rattle going on with the snare, so I've pulled that right out. But what is interesting is in the bleed options, where it says edit here, you can go into bleed options. Now the lights aren't on, which makes it look like they're off, but in reality any instrument that has this little circle by it, that means that the sound is coming through regardless of bleed. It's not actual bleed, it's the actual sound for that instrument. So with the X drum snare, I've decided on this particular microphone that it needs to be pulled down a bit, and I've done the same with a couple of the others. On the bottom condenser mic, I've pulled down my original snare and left the X drum snare at full. So there is some editing of the values on all the volumes for these different mics to mould my original snare sound to send through to my snare bus here. Again, on the snare, it's all pretty straightforward. If I get this playing for you, we've just got a normal sort of EQ where I've raised the low mid for the crack and the high end for the snare rattle. I've then just compressed it in a standard way, but I found that wasn't enough. Now I do have a parallel compression track here where I've got compression, very heavy compression on there, and almost 8:1 -20 threshold. That's pretty heavy compression to add a bit more of a crack. But then I've also set up a further send just to a snare on its own, where I've added a transient attack to give it a really hard attack, and an EQ that's taken away a bit of the top end, quite mid and low mid heavy, to really add a bit more body to it. This is where these all route out to the stereo out, so they're all ending up in the same place, just so you're aware. If you were changing this for a multi-out setup, I would still recommend sending all of these to one snare output on your DAW. You can mix them here and just send them through so you've got your finished snare sound just on one track if you want to add further. Now toms, again, very straightforward. Just going to set up a tom loop here. Now the toms Superior Drummer are a brilliant quality sounding. Just raised a bit of the low mids with the filter to bring out the bass of the toms nicely. EQ'd them as you would expect for some toms, again with some low, the mid scooped out and then a high crack, and compressed them and sent a tiny bit to the parallel bus. That's all that's required for them. Everything else is down to the room mics and the overheads, and again, no massive surprises. I've done similar things to what I did with the Avatar kit. There's a simple filter and EQ on the overheads to take off any of the low junk that those cymbals can create. The important thing to remember with your room mics, you'll see I haven't used all of them because they're not really necessary, especially in metal. You don't want too much of this room ambience coming through because you're going to muddy the mids for the rest of your instruments. So when you do choose to use them, you've got to make sure you're using them well and properly, and that they need to be there. I've got, through one of the room mics, I've taken down or you see they're not even on. I've taken off all of the cymbals, so that's just my kick, my snare, my toms coming through there, so I can control them. They're pretty much on full. And then I've got one further room mic, which is an ambient one for the whole kit, and I've adjusted the volumes accordingly to even it out, and that's all that's required. It does make a significant difference to the sound of the kit though if I mute them and get this playing. That's with nothing. Certainly add some life to the kick there. That's pretty much the whole kit discussed. As I say, it's all set up really to be sent to one stereo out. If you wanted to route them out individually to a multi-channel out, please be aware that over on the left here with the kick, the snare and the toms, I've first of all routed them over to buses, so make sure it's the buses you route out to individual channels and not the individual kick or snare sounds over here on the left. That concludes my Superior Drummer tutorial. I hope you enjoy those presets and download them and have a mess around with them and create your own kits from them. I'm hoping you'll find them to be a lot more pleasing than the Metal Foundry presets, which really disappointed me considering they've got some big names here. I don't want to really put myself in any crap by saying who I didn't like, but when you've got the likes of Devon Townsend here, there's ones that are set up for Gene Hoglan as well, and obviously the guys from Meshuggah who are sponsored by Superior Drummer. I was actually really disappointed with a lot of those presets. A couple of them are pretty good, but in general they actually sounded pretty bad, to be honest. So hopefully this one will at least give you a good starting point to work from, and thank you for watching.